Dear panel, we in the opening government stand for two things. First of all, for the prevention of war crimes, and second of all, for the lower number of unnecessary wars that we believe are now waged in the status quo. First, I'm going to speak on the first point. We believe that the lack of control and oversight over independent military contractors is something that leads to a terrible amount of hardship and harm that can be actually called a war crime. And I'm now going to explain why. So the governments that employ independent military contractors have much less control over those actors, control over their activities, their policies, their training. All of this is lower because they have fewer tools and also fewer incentives to have that control over military contractors. Why do the governments have fewer incentives to have very strong oversight over military contractors? Because those military contractors are not directly tied to the government or the country in the eyes of the public and of other international actors. For instance, if you see a news article that says that, oh, US soldiers killed civilians or fired on a wedding or did something else, then it is a great scandal. It is something that is shown on the news in the US, that is something that is seen as a stain on the reputation of the military, something that the US government shouldn't have allowed to exist, and that is also something that can be brought up by international commissions and can be voiced by representatives of other governments. While when you're using external military contractors, those are not directly tied to your country, and the government can always say that, oh, they are not part of our military, they are independent contractors, we will fire them and we will sign a contract with a different entity. We didn't know what was happening there. That means that their incentive to exercise control over military contractors is always much lower. But even if they did have that will to exercise control and oversight over military contractors, they don't have direct control, operational control over those contractors, because the idea of military contractors is that they are much more independent than the military of the country. If they weren't, the countries would have no incentives to use them whatsoever, because if you control them completely and if you set the same requirements for training, oversight, and so on, it means that those contractors basically become a part of your military. For them to be seen, or for them to be qualified as military contractors, they need to be somewhat independent. And the degree of their independence is quite high, and that is the degree of independence in training. You can't tell them that they need to undergo ethical training, that they need to train in that area. And even if you do, then they can tell you that they have conducted those trainings, but actually not do that fully or completely, or not test their soldiers, and so on. And you can't control their daily operations because you give them a task, and then they use methods that they see fit to achieve that task. You are also limited in control of the information flows, because when something happens with your own military and your own soldiers, the information flows directly and automatically to you. You can see all the track records of all the recordings from video, or like the equipment they're using now. While the independent contractor is a company, a corporation, and they have their own information, and if something bad happens, if their soldiers do something that is harmful, they can very easily try to conceal that and not tell the government that this happens. And also, the control is much laxer in the type of people that tend to work for military contractors. Because for those people, generally, the money tends to be the key motives. And while for many soldiers, the reason why they go into the military is ethical, because they want to protect their country, they see their country as important or glorious, and they want to protect its reputation, the people in military contractors, they are normally hard-earned soldiers by working for different governments, and they don't really care about the reputation of your country. And that is overlaid over the stress of war and other conditions of war. And that leads to a very high probability that those independent contractors will indeed sometimes let themselves to perform some war crimes. Why is that? For reasons of retaliation. If you have worked with your comrade for a long time and that the comrade is killed, you really want to avenge them. Or maybe you have a power trip because you have a gun in your hand and what you tell other people they have to do because you have a threat of violence. Or maybe you have PTSD from prior experiences. And that means that a war is a setting where you need very, very strict oversight over all the actors involved. And unless you have that oversight, which in the case of military contractors you don't, then the civilians get hurt because, for instance, your soldiers want to retaliate against them for killing one of their own. Or maybe there is torture because there are your military contractor want to achieve their goal with any means necessary, and they torture their opponents, or they try to capture economic resources or exploit the population in the region. And we believe that this is what we have to oppose on the side government. Thank you.
Thank you to the Prime Minister. I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition to take the floor, and also just to check whether we have closing opposition.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. 1 second. Okay. So what is important to know in this debate? It is the mercenaries will exist on both sides of the house, because these are the people who are the former soldiers who only can earn money by killing, by shooting, by participating in wars. So what we're gonna say to you today is two arguments. The first one, why it is just for the governments to use the mercenaries to protect their citizens, and secondly, considering that the mercenaries will exist on both sides of the house, why they will go to the terrorist groups and will influence the wars and types of crimes that those groups do, which is bad for us. But before that, some points of rebuttal. Firstly, on the think of government when they say that governments have fewer incentives to protect and to somehow restrict those mercenaries. Firstly, is that probably the people will now still blame the governments if those mercenaries do some crimes. So they will say that the US contractors did this. Say they can still do this even though they are not the part, these mercenaries are not the part of the army, of US army. Secondly, is that the governments have the incentives to win the war. And therefore, if the mercenaries are likely to kill the civilians and therefore make the war ineffective, it is most likely that those governments won't pay for those mercenaries. They will find other mercenaries who will stick to what they say. But also, we believe that there are a lot of the ways that government can restrict and make those mercenaries do what the governments need to do. Because firstly, we can put the contracts on that. That means that we say, if you will kill some civilians and we will find out that you do some crimes, we want you give the money, and those people, because we agree that they're most likely to want to earn the money, they will stick to that. Secondly, is that they have reputational risks. So if you kill, for example, someone in the war, therefore that army the US government, for example, wouldn't want uh, to pay you and to pay you later on. Therefore, you don't want to commit those crimes because you understand you need somehow to earn the money. Therefore, you will stick to the rules that we are telling to him. Thirdly, is that yes, because they don't really want to earn only the money, they have no incentives to shoot the civilians, because the civilians are getting shot because of the hatred or the nationalism that exists. Because those people do not have those kind of emotions, they have no incentives to kill the civilians. But firstly, is we do not agree that those people, mercenaries, are independent as a whole. They're only free to choose the army and the contract, but they still have to stick to the things that are set in the contract in order for them to get this money. So this is basically just as some some treaty that we make with them. Okay, now why the governments, it is right for them to do this? Because basically what they're doing is sending not their own citizens to the war or to the operations, but sending these mercenaries. We believe it is a just thing to do, because the governments have a right, a more right in compared to other citizens, to protect their own citizens and not the citizens of the other country, as they might be the mercenaries or the other civilians. Because firstly, it is what the government was created for, to protect their own citizens. But secondly, is because when people go to army, they actually lose their agency, because they have to stick to the rules what government said. And we think we are taking a lot of the freedom from those people when they do this. Therefore, it is just for the government to send the other people to die and not their own citizens. But now, regarding the terrorist groups, why they will become much more? Because what we do right now is that, considering that those people, mercenaries, I mean, have still a need to earn the money, what they will do when they will be banned? It means that the Western countries wanted to be able to hire those people, because this is banned, and therefore they will probably suffer a lot of the money costs if they will get sued for that. So they won't be doing it either way. So that means that these people, mercenaries, have to earn money. Therefore, the incentive is to go to the terrorist group, where it is most likely they can earn that money that they need, because this is the only way they can earn money. Therefore, they continue to participate in those terrorist groups, and this is really harmful for us. Why? Because firstly, those groups are most likely to be really impactful on the battle, because these are the professional killers, the people who have a lot of the experience. Therefore, they might be able to really influence the operation and to prevent us, for example, from taking the important city or battleground that we need to win. But secondly, is that because they can educate the other terrorists, because of their professionality, they can make other terrorists fight a lot better. But thirdly, is because it will be much easier to hire new terrorists, and new other terrorists will go to those terrorist groups, because now they understand that there are some cool mercenaries competing and fighting for that terrorist group. Therefore, they feel like they can win in that war, because they see the good examples of those people fighting for those groups. What we propose to you is that when they will be when they're not banned, we can take those terrorists and we can make them fight for the Western countries, and they will do it. Why they have the incentives to go to our armies, I mean the Western? Firstly, is because they can probably now earn the same money, because they will be the contractors. Therefore, they can we can somehow make a deal with them on how much they would need to get that money. Therefore, it'll be kind of equal. And secondly, is because they won't be now able to lose the money if they're the part of the terrorist group. Because if you're a part of terrorist group, you probably will be restricted. Your bank accounts will be restricted. You won't be able to spend your actually money. Therefore, it is plausible for them to go to stick to our army, because they can at least spend this money. It doesn't go for nothing. In the comparative, what we see is that if we don't do this, the only way for them to actually continue earning their money is go into terrorist groups. Therefore, we believe that this will be a lot harmful, really harmful for the society, really harmful for the way the wars go. And for these reasons, we believe that we have to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for their speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to take the floor.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Just a second. Let's go. First of all, about opening position. Opening position tell us this is justified. Our answer is that it can be just only if private companies are efficient. Why this is important? Because we think that government actions can be justified only if they're as efficient as possible. And the problem is that they are not so efficient because of the reasons my teammate explained to you. There is no explanation on opposition side. And thusly, we say that you can pay to your regular army and to people to join this regular army without those bad consequences which were given to you. Second of all, they tell us we can use contract mechanisms to make private companies not commit war crime. Our answer is simple. This mechanism and all contracts mechanism can be efficient only if you will have enough proofs for the courts to enforce, to prove the fact of committing of war crime by PLC, and you will get enough enforcement mechanisms for this, thusly. But the problem is that information about war crime usually not very publicly available, and PLC very often are the only person who know about those crimes, and they do not have incentives to tell you the truth because they will lose their money, and thus we do not understand how contract mechanism can work. But moreover, we say that PLC can walk out from negotiations with those governments in those cases. Why? Because they will not take significant risk of the full determination of the contract just because of particular war crimes, which is very significant part of actions of private companies, and thusly probability of realization of risk of determination is extremely high. Third point about terrorists, this is extremely funny actually. I do not understand why those people will not join regular army of any country, or I don't know, French foreign legion, or why those people will not make usual common economic activities. They won't be, I don't know, work as sellers in any grocery and everything of this, where they will not face probability of death, probability of punishment from the government and all that stuff. I do not understand why this is possible. Our case is simple: deterrence of military's action. Why does this work? We say that private companies members have a lot of significant threats where I want to talk about. First of all, they're usually experienced and well equipped, and thusly people, constituencies, don't believe in real possibility of devastating consequences for contractors. Second, those members receive market payments, not just some money from the government in case of prescription, and this price include risks of death or injury. It can comprise of insurance terms and so on, and thusly all those consequences of injury, for instance, seems to be more morally justified in comparison with the regular army, whose members are not insured by the government in that sense. Moreover, we say those people fight for money and not ideology. Therefore, their moral status is as low as it possible. And finally, we say that private companies very often can consist of foreign citizens, and moreover can have no attachment to particular country or to particular government, and thusly it's extremely hard to prove that particular certain PLC is connected to particular certain government. And and we understand that also contracts between government and PLC are very often always, no, sorry, always under commercial, under legal privilege, and we cannot prove existence of them. All that means two things. First of all, lack of incentives for instance, media or for independent journalists to investigate crimes or actions of those of PLC, and thusly, and it engender lack of publicly available information about them. Second of all, even if information were available, people wouldn't give a damn about contractors and their deaths and injuries. All that means that deterrence of conflict and military actions through re-elections cannot work if it is available to use private contractors. Comparison with one more possible case, the consequences are extremely simple. It leads to more conflicts and it leads to more devastating consequences for people. It means death, it means economy destruction, and all that bad stuff. Comparison with probable opposition case. Private companies can defend or governments can defend their investments, for instance, mines or oil infrastructure, with using of private companies. We say that all of them have very simple alternatives. And thus they are less important. This alternative is very simple. It's a regular army which you can use, and it also case for private companies who can use simple lobby. For instance, Lukoil in Russia or anyone else, I think, have enough lobby resource to push Russian government to use regular army for this case. On the other side, victims of war have no real appropriate, adequate choice and alternative. The only alternatives they've got is to leave their places of living, and we say it doesn't cost all benefits on opposition side, and thusly, please. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their speech and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to take.
Is the sound okay?
Yes, it's good.
Thank you. One moment. Okay. So more conflicts on the side of government is a complete lie, because it's not mercenaries, it's not soldiers, it's even not the generals who make this decision. It's politicians who decide to go into war, who would like to have more economic benefits or have more political benefits, meaning that wars, conflicts, and all the consequences in terms of victims of war will still happen on the side of government. And if they do not show us how this army will ever be effective and how they prevent war crimes from happening, they cannot win this debate. We have several reasons why contractors do not have any incentive to do war crimes. First of all, these are people who are not driven by hatred, and hatred is the core reason why people commit war crimes, because they feel hatred towards people who made them in danger, because they hate people who made their families in danger. This is the reason why they kill the civilians, why they commit genocides and all other atrocious stuff, meaning that if the main objective of a person is to earn money, he would do all the stuff that is set in contract and nothing more, because he is not paid for doing anything more, meaning that these people have no objective to commit these crimes. Next reason, we also believe that these people do not have any irrational emotions, like, for example, fear. Fear also sometimes leads to these war crimes, and these people like money and like war. They chose war as their profession. They go there, fight for something that we ask them to do, meaning that they are not driven by any irrational things in this world in order to commit something they didn't plan to do. Also, we believe that contract is something to control them, because if we say that if you commit war crime, or if you torture someone, or if you do not report to us correctly, you won't get the money. These people go to war exactly to get the money. They put their life in danger in order to earn the money that the salary that we pay them, meaning they will have an incentive to obey the rules that we will put in the contract and be efficient. Also, I will believe that the contractors can be as efficient as the regular army and even more efficient. First, they would like to get the money, meaning that they have direct objective to win the battle or have successful operation, and they do everything possible to do this operation successful, which already makes us a bit more efficient army, because our regular army can have different types of concessions, like, for example, if danger is too much, or if soldiers start to rebel because they're afraid. Contractors do not have this type of things, meaning that they would probably have more chances of success. Second reason, they want to keep reputation. This is something that Roma talks about. They would like to be hired again. They would like to take part in other operations in order to earn money. Therefore, if they lose, they probably won't get hired, meaning that they have an incentive not to lose. Third reason, they have an incentive to be efficient, because this is something they are hired for. The contracts oblige them to do this. And fourth reason, the most important one, these are rational people with cold heads, because they are not blackened by fear, hatred, or other stuff, meaning that they clearly understand what is necessary to do. They clearly see the risks. They clearly see the conditions they are in, meaning that they can make more effective decisions because they are rational. Why we believe that enough proofs will also exist on our side of the house, and we will be able to impose this contract control. OG says that we will not have a clue about all the war crimes that are happening during the wartime. This is also a lie. Three reasons for that. First, there are other troops located there. They can report to us. We have our military forces there. We have our other people joined in military action there. They can report to us. We have also media reporting. Media is also present wherever the conflict is, meaning that they can have all the information about all the stuff that is happening. And even if they do not know that this is our contractors, we will see the report, and we will know that these are our people who made something that is out of our contract conditions. And third reason is international reporting. UN, NATO, all other organizations that are present in the conflict zones in order to have proper reporting will also help us to get information about all this bad stuff that our contractors do, and make us help to control them and not to pay them if they do these war crimes. Also, we believe that these people won't join the army as OG proposes due to three reasons. First, they can actually earn the less money. They conduct simple cost-benefit analysis. They think about how much their life costs and how much they would like to earn, and then compare the options. If their local army offers them less than they can earn in all other contractors options, like, for example, joining the army of other country or joining the terrorist group, for example, they will go to the option where they can earn more money, because this is their main objective, meaning that they would probably have less incentives to join local armies. Second reason, they cannot choose the conflict they would like to participate in if they join the usual army, because they are now tied to one government, and they are not choosing the conflict they're participating in, because it's the government who chooses the conflicts. Meaning that if these people would like to earn more money and, for example, take part in Syria and in Yemen and in several other regions, they won't be able to do so, so they prefer to stay on their own and choose the conflicts. And third reason, they are not the citizens of the country that offer a lot of money for their contractors. For example, if I am Ukrainian, I cannot choose to serve in French army for contract, meaning that these people probably have less incentive to join usual armies, and they have more incentive to join contractors. However, if we ban contractors at all, these people still have an incentive to earn money, and this is critically important, because we have still one option to go. We have terrorist groups who offer money for serving in their armies and for fighting for them, and this is what makes this terrorist group more efficient, because now they have professional actors who can teach, who can act on themselves, who can influence the results of battles and of operations, meaning that our local armies, all the lives of soldiers whose agency we have taken out are now dependent on these people who we, by our hands, led to those terrorist groups, meaning that we create even more risks for our local armies, and this is something not that's something that cannot be accepted. Therefore, we ask you to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Opposition to make this for their speech and invite the member of government to take the floor. And can I just check whether the closing opposition team, which was expected, has arrived, or whether we're swinging instead?
No, I think they're not here, so I'll be swinging probably.
Much appreciated. Thank you very much. Sorry to drop you in this.
Okay, I will start in 1, 2, 3. It is important to highlight that the characteristic of the debate, as it was mentioned by the opening government, is that we want to prevent a war. That is our main objective, and I also agree that a war leads to terrible results because it increases the level of violence, and also it promotes the level of fears inside the population. I want to summarize just some key points that our opponent government bring to the debate, and they say that they can be controlled, and also there is, as I mentioned before, devastating consequences for the population, and also they establish that they are not part of the government, and also our opening opposition didn't they accept this statement, they accept this status quo, they accept these characteristics, and therefore what I'm going to say is valid, because I will bring to this debate two main arguments, which is the principle of competence and that the military contracts and mercenaries don't resolve the problems. But I will explain this later. First, I would like to do some rebuttals to our opposition, and it's because they say that mercenaries are going to exist in both sides of the war, and I don't think this is necessarily true, because some countries doesn't have any military army and doesn't have any military power. For example, countries in Latin America, most of them, they don't use any military force, and they are good in that way. Like they don't need it, they don't depend in those groups, and they are working normally and even efficiently, because war is not represented in those countries, as well as in some countries in Europe that or other countries that doesn't have these military services, and they don't need them. Like they can work and make their own decisions without using the violence and without incentivizing the fearness in the population. Also, they say they bring basically two main arguments, like is that mercenaries are to win the war, and also that the government has the right to do it. But that is not the case in this debate. In this debate, we should focus more in why we should ban it. Like why they shouldn't focus more in why we shouldn't ban them. And this clearly statement doesn't tell us why exactly, or doesn't prove why exactly we shouldn't we should put above the fact of not contracting. And they say also that there is the right to protect their own citizens, and the opposition want. They say that it is not the right of the people to send other people to die, but their own people. But for resolve a political moral issue, dies are not necessarily. We said that this increase the fearness in the population, and also opposition. Even though opposition wants to say that win a war is the most important thing because of whichever benefits as power, okay. But these groups are necessary to do that, because to win a war, actually it is also like use the diplomacy or some other strategies. For example, if the in a commercial war or any kind of other war, that these forces to resolve the problem doesn't resolve the problem, they increase that. So our having said that, I would like to introduce like our principle of confidence. Because of these issues and because of this fairness that these military equipment and military contracting are provoking, we say that this would weaken the confidence inside the country, because people are going to be more afraid to themselves. They are going to be in a lack of confidence because they're going to see everywhere militaries with guns and with. Sorry, do you have a point?
Yes. So if there are other options to win the war, then we are most likely to use it as well before we send the mercenaries to fight for us. So we have this case in our world as well.
Okay, but if, as you mentioned, if there is another ways to win the war, we shouldn't like send these military forces, because they're gonna worse the situation. Because what motivates them, as you mentioned, they motivates them the money, not to resolve the issue. They probably want to win a war, but what they are not going to focus in the loss of life that is going to be like for the population, and also in the devastation for the population. They are just going to focus in win the war. So if we have another ways to win a war, as you already recognize that we have, then that proves that we don't necessarily need these forces, because they are increasing like the violence and not necessarily resolving the problem. And also, as you mentioned, you said that they can be more, well, the opening opposition said that they can be more efficient than the army. But okay, if they are more efficient than the army, this is a bad investment for the government, because they should then invest in the army and increase the power of the army and increase the intelligence of their own army, because this is the army that is going to be in their side, in their country more time. But however, these contracts are not like permanent, and they are using an investment that they could lead to another places like education or improve their own institutions. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the member of government for their speech and invite the member of opposition to take the floor. And thank you very much again for swinging.
Just give me a second.
Thanks. Do you want to give a whip as well, by the way, or do you just want to give an op extension?
Yeah, it'll be fine.
Cool, thank you.
I'll just pause the recording.
Okay, the case that closing government want to bring us is that there is that the reputation of the country is in more risks if they don't hire like military contractors and mercenaries. But I think this is not necessarily true, because the reputation of the country it is not measured in how it is not measured like in all the aspects in how you can fight or bomb another country or create more war, but in other aspects like economic and social, like development, and also in the characteristics of their own groups. And also they want to bring us like they can increase the confidence of the people by what the government said, but this is not true, because in some countries where the military forces has been like very, very present or have been part of the important decisions, people is who more suffered. For example, we don't have to go like so far, but with the case of Venezuela in South America, or for example Brazil, where it doesn't matter what the government was their own country the military forces, sorry, were their own government, and they were really part of the government and taking most of the decisions, and people were more insecure because of all the violence they use. Because what is the metrics that military usually use in order to establish the order or something? They use the guns, they use bombs of gas, or they use another harmful materials that the population are not ready and not prepared, and also don't have the protection against those arms. And this is incredible. We make is to decrease the level of confidence, even for the people and also for the government. And even though if opposition want to say that we're not talking about like the military forces of their own country, but we're about the private military forces or mercenaries, it was approved in the characteristic of the debate that they are a part of main decisions. Like if they don't have the complete power, because the complete powers have the government and the president, and is the main power, but they influence in the decision of the government, and they are really present, because if they are going to be hired for the government, it's not just for do what the government said, but also to influence in their opinions, because they are going to try to persuade with the intelligence and the psychological training that they have. They are absolutely want to try to influence the government in order to their favor, and also then the decision of the government is going to be represented, and it's going to be more characteristic of a military aspect or of a military response. So therefore, I would like to highlight why it's better in my side of the house, why our world is more where democracy is better represented, and also why our population is going to be more like happy. And it is because they are going to have, like, without these private military contracts and without these mercenaries and without all the violence these people are bringing, our people is going to be more happy, like more confidence. And even though if there exist some problems in the economy, or these problems are not going to be comparable with those that can be brought by the violence and also by the forces of gun and the war that all the military contracts and mercenaries represent, because they are trained for that, like for fight. They are not trained for resolve democracy problems or other kind of problems, but through fighting. So in our side of the house, we have a government that have the capability to resolve their problem, and also have the freedom to do that without using the violence, without hurts their own population, and without decreasing the level of confidence of their population. We also say that in our side of the house, this government will have more money, because they are not going to be investing, as I mentioned in my second argument, that the private military contractors and mercenaries doesn't resolve the problem. And as I already respond to the point of that these military private contracts could be better than an army, I already mentioned that this money or this investment they are going to be used to pay those teams. It's better to invest in another side of the country, for example, in the economy, or to improve the education, or to improve the security, but in another aspect for the population, for example, in crimes handled by their own people, because in every country there's people that doesn't obey the law. So this money would be better invested in resolve those issues than in paying for a military private contractor or mercenaries that are going to create more violence. So in that aspect, I would say that it's better in our words than in the closing government. And also from our just to remember, from the aspect from our opening opposition, we already also have a better world, because they say that because okay, they want to bring us like okay, because they bring us a right. They have that the government have the right to do that, and also that their motivation is to win the war. But this is not enough to respond the main question of the debate, that is why we shouldn't, or why we should invest or hire these people to do aspects or to resolve problems in our country. So for that, very glad to propose.
I'd like to thank the government whip for their speech and invite the opposition whip to take the floor. Thanks. Everyone, right? Cool, I'll get going. Great. So thank you. This was a good debate, and we enjoyed it, and we had a unanimous call with both of us on the panel. The call is the first went to opening government, the second went to closing opposition, the third went to opening opposition, and the fourth, unfortunately, to closing government. So first to OG, second to CO, third to OO, and fourth, unfortunately, to CG. Why does that call come to pass? Just one brief kind of broader comment on this debate before that, which is a lot of the analysis is very good, very high quality, good rebuttal, etc. But I think the kind of structural problem with it is that the lack of examples, and that it sometimes doesn't really feel like it's happening in the real world. So I guess examples like Blackwater in the US, or G4S in the UK, or Wagner Group in Russia, there's quite a lot of real world examples, and there's quite a lot of conflict where these PMCs are currently being used. And that, I think, could have been referenced a lot more, not necessarily because it would actually have improved the analysis, but just because I think when people use real world examples, it helps make things seem much more grounded and give the debate much more of a sense of reality, rather than feel like it's a debate happening in the abstract, which this debate, although high quality, it did occasionally feel like it was a bit disconnected from reality, that people were discussing debating constructs in a high quality way, but maybe that there needed to be more real world examples. So moving on to the cases of individual teams and how they placed the way they did. So in terms of the opening government team, so I think opening government make two essential claims. The first claim is that PMCs are significantly more likely to commit abuses because they are less accountable. The government doesn't directly control them, and it can just say, well, it's not us if they do, and also because they don't have the kind of control structures which you expect with a military. And the second claim they make is that you have a lesser deterrent effect from allowing countries to go to war, because people can just say, well, you know, it's private military contractors, they've signed up for it, they're experienced, and also they're foreign citizens rather than our citizens. Anyway, I think broadly, opening government do a reasonably good job of analysing both these key claims and prove them to a reasonable degree. The opening opposition case which we get against this makes two claims. Firstly, or three claims, I think. Firstly, that there are still significant incentives and reasons to believe that people will not commit war crimes and would be deterred from doing so. Because the government can still be blamed if private military contractors are used, because private military contractors can be financially punished if they've committed war crimes, because there are reputational risks for the private military contractor, because they might not be used again if they're known as someone who shoots civilians, but also they're not being paid to shoot civilians, so why would they waste their time doing so? And they then make three specific broader claims. The first one is the government has a right to protect its own citizens and should prevent them from having the horrible experience of warfare. Secondly, that if mercenaries are not hired by respectable PMCs, as an alternative, they will choose to join terrorist groups or similar. And thirdly, that they give a lot more analysis and reasons why there are going to be other troops located nearby, and are therefore going to be able to have a high degree of scrutiny. And also PMCs are more professional than the military anyway, and they're therefore going to do a better job and be more in control rather than less in control as claimed by the government, and therefore starting to claim that PMCs are actually going to be better and more effective. I think that opening opposition does a very reasonable job of mitigating the key claim coming out of government, which is that PMCs are more likely to commit war crimes, by showing that the government will still be held somewhat accountable and the government has mechanisms to hold them to account. However, I think what I would note is that they only mitigate that claim rather than show it to be untrue. And I think both sides would agree that the government appears to have more mechanisms to hold its own military to account, and that the reputational risk of their own army committing war crimes is higher than the reputational risk of a private military contractor committing war crimes. So it is seemingly somewhat more likely, I think is the consensus of the analysis when combined, that a PMC would commit war crimes, because there are ways that the government can control them, but they're not as great as the control they have over their own military. And I think the difficulty with this analysis from an opening opposition point of view is they never criticize the military structures of Western governments to the extent which they can do, i.e., they do a good job of showing why opening government's claim that there's no control over PMCs is untrue and exaggeration. But the other key opening government claim, which is an implicit one, is that there's very good control over militaries and that you can prevent militaries from committing war crimes without difficulty. And I think what OO don't do is show why militaries might be more likely to commit war crimes in some circumstances, might have less idea what they're doing, etc. And that's the claim which then comes out of closing opposition in a more substantive way. I think the second problem with the opening opposition case is that the point around principle is based on the assumption that either the alternative is people being conscripted into the army, and it's not explained why that's the alternative, unfortunately, or secondly, that all these people are from abroad rather than citizens of the country itself. And because you can have PMCs from its own country, that somewhat mitigates that point, although it does have value about the government's legitimacy in employing others rather than their own citizens. In terms of the point around why people will join terrorist organizations as an alternative, I think the response from opening government, which is that terrorist organizations are not the plausible alternative to someone who can't get a job in the PMC, but instead they'd rather join their national army or find more normal work, is compelling for the version of the case which it emerges. I.e., opening opposition always talk about terrorist organizations. They don't talk necessarily about criminal groups. And I guess characteristically, a terrorist organization probably does not feel like the best way to make money. And generally the associations people would have with it isn't that it's a very profitable organization. And I think the opening opposition analysis explains very well why people who are mercenaries will seek to maximize for their own profit and to pursue a career in fighting. But it doesn't necessarily explain why a terrorist group is going to provide that best and why they'll be able to make enough money with a terrorist group to incentivize them. And what we talked about quite a lot in the adjudication is that there are plausible examples where people would want to join a criminal group like the Mexican Mafia or similar, but those aren't really raised by opening opposition about why a terrorist group is likely to be profitable. And in the absence of that, I think opening government's response, which is essentially this is quite an implausible and extreme claim, and that instead people are more likely to take up normal work or join a regular military, I think is sufficient to take down that point. In terms of the final claim coming out of opening opposition, which is that the private military contractor is going to be better because it is incentive driven and therefore has an incentive to be more effective because if it performs its job, it will be more financially effective. There is never a direct response to this claim from the government, which obviously lends quite a lot of weight to this claim. I think the problem with it from my perspective is twofold. The first one is there is not an impact linked to this point, which is to say it explains why PMCs are going to be more effective, but if they are more effective at doing something which is not a good objective, then that sounds harmful rather than inherently beneficial. And there comes an attempt at impacting that from the closing opposition, but the impact of why it is beneficial for them to be more effective, unfortunately, isn't there in the opening opposition. And the second one is to make that analysis stronger. I think there needs to be more comparison with why the regular army isn't also incentivized to do things, or why it won't also be incentivized to do things. I get the implicit claim here, which is that money is a better motivator. But I think that needs to be explored more about why money is a better motivator than your chain of command or wanting to be promoted, etc. I think the result of that is, at the end of the top half, opening opposition has done a reasonable job of mitigating the key opening government claim, which is that PMCs are likely to commit war crimes, and shown that the government has many more incentives and mechanisms to prevent PMCs from committing war crimes that opening government has claimed. However, they haven't actually shown that that point isn't true to at least some extent. They have not responded explicitly to the second opening government point, which is that PMCs are more experienced, etc., and therefore they deter you from going to war because you say, well, we've got our PMCs, so it's fine. We won't bother to we won't bother to look into them. We won't bother to worry about going to war because we know that people have signed up, and therefore you end up with more conflict. And their own points around principal material, why PMCs are less effective, are more effective, etc., aren't sufficient to take it over the two harms proven to some extent by opening government, and therefore opening government takes it narrowly-ish in the top half. Bringing in closing government. We felt that the problem with closing government was that there is a lot of rebuttal here, much of it quite good, but the problem is that there is a lack of a full extension. So at the risk of labouring the point, I think the extension doesn't really start, unfortunately, until about 4 minutes 30 in the member of government speech, at which point then there's also a POI, so the time is taken out. I think the extension, which becomes unfortunately somewhat clearer in the whip than it has in the member of government, is essentially that PMCs are a threat to the citizens of the country because they risk oppressing the citizens of the country by creating a military regime, etc. Examples from Latin America helpfully cited. I think that the structural problem with this point is that it's premised on the alternative to private military contractors being pacifism and there being no military force, whilst opening government have set the debate up as the alternative is using standard militaries instead, and that being more useful than private military contractors. At which point, unfortunately, the analytical necessity for the closing government extension is to prove that private military contractors are more likely to abuse the kind of civilian population of their country than the regular army would be. I guess that's a somewhat plausible claim because you could say, well, the regular army is from the country in all cases. They probably really believe in their states. They don't want to shoot their fellow citizens, etc. So that is a claim which could maybe work. But unfortunately, it's not made in that form. And there isn't a comparison of a private military contractor versus a regular army. And therefore, it can't stand as a sufficient extension to beat either the two opening half teams. Some of the rebuttal is valuable. I think the problem with quite a bit of it, unfortunately, though, is it hinges on there being an alternative world where there is no war, and that being attainable, where states will choose to solve their problems by other means. I think, unfortunately, it would be great if such a world were possible to envisage. But I think it seems unlikely that that world will come about, and that I don't think the closing government have enough fiat to say that they will create that world as an alternative. So at that point, unfortunately, much of that rebuttal doesn't function because it seems that there are circumstances in which you can't use sanctions or diplomacy as an alternative, and therefore military force of some sort will continue to be necessary. So the comparative is then between the army and the PMCs. Bringing in the closing opposition. So closing opposition is slightly difficult to judge in this debate, mainly for the reason that they add significant new chunks to the opening opposition claims without necessarily taking them to the full extent they could be taken, but they still, I think, add significant new impacts and pieces of analysis which are useful. The first new impact and piece of analysis they add, which I think is really useful, is that states will actually be more inclined to hide the crimes of their own soldiers because they're more responsible rather than to hide the crimes of the PMCs. And I guess where this goes beyond the claim which opening opposition has made is opening opposition just said that PMCs, the government could hold PMCs to account in the same way they could the regular army, whilst the closing opposition case is that the government will actually hold PMCs to account better. And I think the underlying claim that it's less embarrassing for the government to arrest their PMCs than it is for them to arrest their own soldiers is quite plausible and is a useful claim. The second claim we get coming out is that PMCs have more experience of a different type of fighting and different types of war, and therefore will do a better job of fighting than professional armies would. And therefore the wars will end faster, and that will be better, more efficient, and fewer people will die as a result. I think the problem for me with this claim is that the first half, i.e. that private military contractors are going to be better, is very plausible and good. The second half, which is that wars will necessarily end faster, seems to be in some ways quite logically questionable, which is to say, it makes sense if you assume that only one side has private military contractors, or the side which has the private military contractors is going to win. But if you think that a side is losing and is destined to lose anyway, and then you add private military contractors to it, who the analysis says are better and more effective, then in that case they'll lose more slowly than they otherwise would have done. And more people will die in the intervening period, or the war will go on for longer. Or conversely, both sides could have better private military contractors, and then the war will go on for longer in a more bloody or brutal way, or similar. So I think the link between more efficient militaries and less war or less brutal war isn't fully completed. That's not contested by the closing government, but I think there is something of a jump there, which could be completed to make the point have its full impact. I think probably the way to make that claim fully is that militaries which are more professional kill fewer civilians, regardless of how long the fighting lasts, because you don't hit the wrong places or anything of that type. And maybe expanding on that ground. The final thing is around respecting the rights of citizens, and essentially there's two important premises of the material which has been made by opening government, opening opposition rather, is stated. The first premise is that conscription is often the alternative, and there's an explanation of why conscription is often the alternative, and it's the right of citizens. And the second premise is that national armies are often badly equipped to deliver, and therefore you're abusing their rights because you don't have a large enough standing army, and you send them in without preparation. That is to some extent implicit in the opening opposition claim. But I think it's substantially new, and it's useful to have those underlying claims of the principle explained. For me, therefore, closing opposition beats opening opposition for those free claims which stand to a great extent, i.e. more aggressive material on why PMCs are actually more likely to be accused of war crimes by governments than the military. Secondly, an explanation of why more experience and PMCs being better leads to shorter wars and therefore better results for civilians. Even though there's a mild analytical problem there, it does expand on the material brought by opening opposition, and adds the impact, which was the problem with opening opposition material, which is that it didn't explain why a government winning a war was better. And finally, that it adds those stated premises to the opening opposition principle material in a way which makes it significantly stronger. Weighing that up against closing government, similarly, I think closing government, for reasons discussed previously, unfortunately, the extension isn't large enough to weigh heavily versus closing opposition. Closing opposition cover about them as well. I think what's less clear to me is whether closing opposition beats opening government. We as a panel ultimately came to the conclusion that they didn't. And the reason for that is that I think some areas of opening government material around why there's less accountability and why mercenaries are more likely to commit war crimes still stands to a significant extent even after closing opposition's good attacks, which is it still seems like governments maybe have somewhat less control over PMCs. But more importantly, I think also the second piece of material in the Deputy Prime Minister about why there is deterrence from using from war if you're using your own soldiers, but there isn't if you're using private military contractors, doesn't get a response from any of the opposition speakers. And I think this is actually potentially quite an impactful piece of analysis, because I guess it's agreed by everyone in the debate that unnecessary war is bad. That impacting could have been done to a greater extent by opening government, but that material isn't really interacted with by the closing opposition or the opening opposition. Given some of the given the analytical problem discussed with the analysis as to why wars will be shorter from closing opposition, that's therefore sufficient for opening government to take it above them. I think if closing opposition's point around why wars will be shorter and why there'll be fewer civilians killed if it's more professional had been kind of proven to a greater extent, although it was proven to some extent, I think that would have allowed closing opposition to take it above opening government because it was quite close. As it is, I think they probably don't quite. Hope that makes sense. Sorry if that was too long. Welcome any questions and happy to chat with people privately if useful. Thank you.
Raffy, thank you very much.
Can we ask one question right now, or we have to do privately?
Yes, whatever works for you. I'm comfortable either way.
Yeah, it's better if you ask, if you answer now. So one question from opening opposition is that you've said that we haven't really destroyed the logic of OG, where they said that there will be more war crimes happening. And so what's about our analysis where we told that those mercenaries don't have any incentives to kill to kill the civilians, because basically this is not what their aim is when they're coming to war. And secondly is that they're probably not feeling the hatred that is a platform for you to kill the civilians. And so that analysis.
Yeah, so I agree that is a useful response. So possibly I should have flagged it. Sorry that I didn't. The problem for me with that is that the opening government claim isn't that mercenaries think it is in their interest to kill people. It's that they get PTSD, or they're angry because their friend has died, and therefore they kill people out of the type of irrationality which happens in conflict. And I guess what opening government doesn't say is that they want to kill people more often than a normal soldier would in the same situation. But what they do say is that both private military contractors and people in the army want to